In the late 2010s, Retrobit announced a dual analog 6-face button Sega Saturn-style Bluetooth controller. After half a decade, it was released and heavily redesigned. No longer Bluetooth, it required a dongle and now with much smaller, nubby analog sticks. The closest to a dual analog controller with 6 face action buttons are controllers for the Xbox, which were either wired or required a dongle. I really don't care for the eschewed, all-catawampus stick layout of the Xbox-style controllers either, though, and rather use something with the PlayStation's parallel stick layout. Besides the Saturn and a few Sega CD and 32X games, the N64 also has 6 face action buttons. Also, the original Xbox had 6 face buttons, although their layout isn't even consistent between the OEM controller version. A little after Retrobit's dual analog Saturn controller was announced, similarly styled Chinese knockoffs were released by several no-name companies. Now, a few issues. One is that although it looks like it has 6 face action buttons, one is for the non-standard screen capture button, and worse, the other button is for the turbo rapid-fire mode switch function, which is a controller firmware feature and wouldn't be moddable with software. I suspected a hardware mod, though, would be possible. And another issue is that many reviews I saw had people say they could only get it to sync via Bluetooth to a Nintendo Switch. So first, yes, this can connect to a Windows PC via Bluetooth. Hold down the left action button, the leftmost button, if not including the turbo and screen capture buttons. It was labeled on my unmodded controller as Y. Instead of the 4 LEDs blinking in sequence, the 2 in the middle should blink together. From there, just pair it as you would any other device. Mine was labeled in Windows as Gamepad X. Now, to turn the turbo and screenshot buttons into something usable requires the controller to be disassembled, which is very easy. 7 screws hold the case together. None are hidden underneath the sticker. Once opened, 2 screws hold the analog board in place and 4 hold the main board, although there are 5 screw holes. First, use some electrical insulation tape and cover the contacts that would trigger the screen capture and turbo buttons. Next, I used some spare wires I had and connected them to the start and select on this controller labeled as the plus and minus buttons. These wires went from there to the spots where the carbon pads on the rubber button part would bridge a tiny gap in those 2 wires when the turbo and screen capture buttons were pressed. I used Kapton tape to hold that end of the wires in place, and it took more than a few tries to get them positioned right. Yes, this mod technically is decreasing the number of buttons and making 2 redundant, but the N64 and Sega systems that had 6 face buttons only had 1 analog and only a start, not a select, so I just mapped start to the second analog's push-in button, usually called R3. The Nintendo 64 had 3 shoulder buttons, so having the 2 extra face buttons linked to shoulder buttons is not ideal, but unfortunately I found that this setup is what all the other 6 face button controllers do. Having them instead linked to start and select actually is better. Although, if I knew how to link them to L3 and R3, that would have been ideal, since neither the N64 nor Saturn analogs are also buttons. So having gotten that to work and after gaming with it for a few hours, I realized 2 things that needed to be addressed. One was the face action buttons being all convex meant it was easy to misplace my thumb and hit the wrong button. The top row buttons are smaller, but not enough that I noticed when playing. On the Saturn, the bottom buttons are both bigger than the top ones and also concave as opposed to the tops being convex. So, using Blender, I modeled some new buttons with the bottom 3 now being concave and 3 printed them out. I also adjusted the height up a couple millimeters as some of the original buttons seemed as they could get jammed below the plastic housing if pressed just right and too hard. I also indented an ABC XYZ label into the buttons. The second issue was the D-pad after a while would stick in one direction. The issue I'm guessing is the plastic parts were too close, and as they rubbed, they got hot and expanded a tiny bit and then started to jam. To fix this, I use sandpaper to remove a tiny bit off of the inside of the D-pad, and since then, I haven't had an issue. I'm sure someone with more experience and/or intelligence with electronics could have done a more elegant and competent mod, but my slipshod job did work twice, actually, so I know it wasn't a fluke or me lucking out. I got 3 of these. 2 I modded and 1 I kept in stock form, since I found there is a Windows to switch controller driver, and I want to see how it works with an unmodded controller. I haven't experimented with that yet, though, and regardless, that turbo button would still not be usable as an action button. Be aware all the shoulder buttons are digital, no analog triggers. This isn't my dream controller, but it is the closest to it in a few ways that nothing else provides, but have no illusions. This is a sub-$20 US controller for clear reasons. I just do gaming casually and almost only retro console gaming through emulation at that. So for me, these modded controllers have worked well enough for me for what I intended to use them for, but I suspect serious gamers would have one thing or another about them to whine about. If you aren't too picky, have been looking for a controller with 6 face action buttons and 2 analogs, and are willing to do a simple hardware mod, then this might be a solution for you.